Metaphilosophy is a topic or field of philosophical study concerned with finding out the nature of philosophy itself, what it is, and what it is for. It is sometimes also called the philosophy of philosophy, because when we are asking questions about the nature and purpose of philosophy, we are doing philosophy about philosophy. This means that metaphilosophy engages us in thinking critically and reflecting on what we are really doing when we do philosophy. One of the main debates in metaphilosophy is between two oppositional understandings of what philosophy is for and what we ought to do when we do philosophy. The debate is between analytic philosophy on the one hand and continental philosophy on the other. As these names suggest, analytic philosophy is thought to be concerned mainly with analysis, and continental philosophy is thought to have emerged from and be most prevalent on the continent, or in other words, mainland Europe. The divide between these two different philosophies has caused strong division amongst philosophers for quite some time. Those who adopt one approach often claim that those who opt for the other approach are not really doing philosophy at all. This is because both analytic and continental philosophers seem to have substantially different and often incompatible views about the nature of philosophy. For instance, analytic philosophers often critique continental philosophers as being unclear, obscure, not putting forward any logical arguments, and relying heavily on literary techniques and rhetoric. But continental philosophers critique analytic philosophers as relying too heavily on rational arguments and being too concerned with playing logical puzzles, failing to acknowledge the fundamental aspects of human existence. So what is really the difference between the two? As we'll see, it's quite hard to pinpoint exactly what the main differences are, to the extent that we might doubt there really is a clear divide between analytic and continental philosophy after all. Let's start by bearing in mind the different philosophical topics that each approach focuses on. Usually, it is considered that continental philosophy will focus on the topics of existence, the meaning of life, art and literature, whilst analytic philosophy will focus on the topics of logic, science and language. Take, for example, Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness or Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which are usually considered examples of continental philosophy, dealing with topics such as being and existence and the meaning of life. As stereotypical examples of analytic philosophy, we could take A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, or Susan Hack's Philosophy of Logics, both dealing with the topics of language, logic, and truth. However, there are many cases of so-called analytic philosophers dealing with the topics of being and life, or art and literature, such as Thomas Nagel's work on death and the absurd, and Catherine Abel's work on fiction and literature. There are also cases of so-called continental philosophers dealing with the topics of logic, language, and science. For instance, Hegel's Science of Logic, or Jacques Derrida's focus on the nature of language in his own method of deconstruction. From these examples, we can see that analytic and continental philosophy overlap in the kinds of similar topics that they deal with. So instead, it might be that the difference between the two is in how they deal with and approach these topics. One way of understanding the difference in their approaches is to consider how analytic and continental philosophy each pay attention to and engage with historical and social context. Continental philosophy is usually considered to emphasize what is called the background conditions of inquiry, including the historical and social aspects that might influence why something is the case. On the other hand, analytic philosophy is usually considered to avoid these background conditions, focusing on ahistorical and universalizable conceptual analysis and logical argumentation. Take, for example, the topic of moral philosophy. Hannah Arendt, who is typically considered to be a continental philosopher, takes her account of moral philosophy and the nature of what counts as good and bad as informed by and relative to the social context of different societies and the historical events that lead to different human actions. On the other hand, G.E. Moore is famously considered as an analytic philosopher, and his inquiry into the nature of good and morality ignores any kind of social or historical basis, and instead attempts to find a general and universal account of the concept of the good. There are, however, cases in which this difference is not so obvious, and where analytic philosophers do engage with historical and social contexts, and where continental philosophers actively try to avoid this. For example, many analytic philosophers do attempt to determine the socio-historical contexts in their philosophical inquiries, such as Bernard Williams' Genealogy of Truth and Miranda Fricker's Genealogical Account of Knowledge. And famously, phenomenologists such as Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who are usually thought to be continental philosophers, adopt a method in which any historical, social, or personal context is cast aside in order to perceive objects as they really are in the here and now. As such, the difference between analytic and continental philosophy cannot be captured as a difference between historical and social engagement in philosophical inquiry. Instead, it might be that the difference between the two is due to their contrasting styles, the way in which different philosophers present and express their work. Analytic philosophy is famously considered to focus on formal and logical argumentation, providing clear definitions and conceptual distinctions, and using easy-to-understand simple language. For example, when reading text by so-called analytic philosophers, such as Miranda Fricker, Bernard Williams, Thomas Nagel, and Catherine Abel, you'll notice their use of clear and easy-to-understand language, and the fact that they offer definitions for the concepts and words that they use, and an obvious argument structure. Continental philosophy, by contrast, is famously considered to use metaphorical language, symbolism, and refrains from offering formal arguments. For instance, when you read any text by Theodor Adorno, Jacques Derrida, Simone de Beauvoir, or Gillian Rose, all considered as typical continental philosophers, what stands out is their complex and verbose writing styles, with content that often seems more like narrative prose or poetry than clear argumentation. However, this difference is not always the case. There are some so-called analytic philosophers, such as Gottlob Frege or Willard Quine, who write using language that is more complex and hard to understand, and make use of technical jargon. Similarly, there are some so-called continental philosophers, such as Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt, who explicitly strive for clarity and structured argumentation. This means that the divide between analytic and continental philosophy cannot be due to differences in style, as this seems to depend on the individual philosophers themselves and the way in which they write. If the difference between analytic and continental philosophy is not explained by differences in topics, styles, or engagement with historical and social context, then what else can we appeal to? In the literature, some other options have been discussed. Perhaps these two approaches to philosophy have different understandings of the nature of truth and knowledge, or perhaps they adopt different methods to gain knowledge and reach an understanding of the truth. Alternatively, perhaps the divide merely arose due to differences in the geographical location of philosophers. All of these suggestions, however, have counterexamples to prove them otherwise, and so it's not obvious that they will be more successful to help us define the difference between analytic and continental philosophy. And so, we can question whether there really is such a divide between analytic and continental philosophy, and how helpful it is to distinguish so clearly between the two. Whether or not it is accurate or useful to divide up the nature of philosophy into two opposing groups, perhaps the debate between analytic and continental philosophy provides us with a starting point to explore the most important metaphilosophical questions. What is philosophy, and what is it for?